Good evening. Welcome to tonight's event, the third in our series, What We Need to Do Next. Over the spring and summer, we'll be meeting like this once a month to confront some of the burning issues affecting us in the world right now, from why work sucks to ending carceral feminism. We hope that each discussion will give you the grounding in the subject at hand and give you the tools you need to join the struggle. Our next event after this one will be with the anti-racist organisers Asfar Shafi and Ilyas Nagdi, authors of the forthcoming book, Reclaiming Anti-Racism, where we'll be discussing the history of anti-racist organising in the UK, whether identity politics is a useful frame for critique of contemporary anti-racist politics, and whether institutions like the Labour Party, trade unions, and other NGOs hold us back from a truly radical anti-racist movement. You can sign up at the link in the chat, which I'll put on there in a minute. I will soon hand over to our chair, Misha, to introduce our speakers, but it is a publisher's duty to let you know that both Tangled in Terror by Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan and The Suspect by Rizwaan Sabir are both half price on the Pluto Press website. Again, I'll put the links to each book in the chat in a moment. Finally, do put your questions for all of our speakers into the chat for the Q&A section of discussion. Now, over to Misha.
Thank you, Kieran, for the kind introduction. So hello, everyone. I'm Misha Fraser-Carroll, and I'm a journalist who writes on politics and pop culture. Tonight, we're going to be talking about resisting the surveillance state with three amazing guests. Our first guest is Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan, a writer, poet, educator, and activist, and the author of Tangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia. Her poetry performances based on her book, Post-Colonial Banter, have millions of views online, and she was a National Roundhouse Poetry Slam runner-up in 2017. Suhaiymah has written for The Guardian and Gaudem, and her work has featured across radio and TV stations. She's been commissioned to write plays by theatres, including the Royal Court. Next, we have Rizwaan Sabir, a lecturer in criminology at Liverpool John Moores University in the UK, and the author of The Suspect, Counterterrorism, Islam and the Security State. His research, which is focused on examining British counterterrorism, was motivated by his wrongful arrest and detention for suspected terrorism when he was found in possession of an Al-Qaeda training manual he downloaded for his postgraduate research. In addition to briefing policymakers such as the Shadow Home Secretary, the United Nations, civil society and community groups, as well as lawyers, he offers analysis and commentary in the broadcast and written media, including BBC News, Sky News, and Al Jazeera. Then finally, we're joined by Kevin Blow, a founding member of the Network for Police Monitoring, also known as NETPOL, in 2009. He's been a staff member since 2014 and became campaigns coordinator in 2021. NETPOL's work highlights aggressive police tactics, intrusive police surveillance, and the government's expansion of public order powers, most recently the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. Before working for NETPOL, Kevin worked in a community centre and spent 25 years as a campaigner with the Newham Monitoring Project in East London. So without further ado, I wanted to get straight into our discussion with a very big question. So I wanted to start by asking, what is the general state of surveillance in the UK right now? How widespread is state surveillance, and who does it most affect? Do you want to start with Kevin?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick this off. Basically, I think it's important to kind of provide at least some background to why it is that the police conduct surveillance in the way they do. So roughly for the last 20 years, the model and approach for dealing with, for conducting surveillance has really been the same model that's used for organised crime. It's less about catching criminals, less about the focus on investigations, but it's much more about assuming that everybody is a potential criminal, and it's about disrupting what are seen as allegedly criminal networks. And what stems from that, the way that surveillance is conducted, is that it involves profiling of those suspect organizations. So their size, their structure, their alliances, their rate of growth. and also the people that are the key organisers within them. So there's a lot of focus on the profiling of individuals. And a major part of that is obviously then using this massive data to try and then undermine the effectiveness of those organisations. Now, as that applies to organised crime, that is also the approach that applies to surveillance of political movements, and it's also the approach that applies to so-called suspect communities. And there are obvious fundamental problems with this, because political movements are not inherently criminal, neither are communities. And much of the intelligence that's gathered is invariably very, very shaky. And what this leads to is inevitably the stereotypes, the assumptions of what is an inherently small c conservative institution like policing, shaping the way that surveillance is conducted, but also because it's self-justifying in many cases. Right? There are people who have an interest in continuing that surveillance. There are people who have individually may have a personal financial interest in the whole idea about tracking so-called extremist ideologies. And whether that, however well that applies, all of that is about attempting to define where the boundaries lie between supposedly acceptable and extreme points of view, political points of view in all cases, which is obviously deeply contested. I mean, I'm sure we will get on to at some point in this discussion talking about the issue around British values, but the way that the state has attempted to define them around issues around the rule of law and tolerance, in many cases you simply need to look at what the government's doing right now, particularly around issues like the rule of law, honesty in public life, and so on, and really question who the extremists are. For many of the movements that we work with, they argue that in a battle to try and stop catastrophic climate change, as the UN Secretary General only said very recently, it's those people that are resisting that attempt to halt the consequences for all of humanity who are the real extremists. And yet the police's response plows on. It plows on because that's the way it is always done, approach these particular issues. And as I said, the benefit of history quite often is that the police invariably end up being on the wrong side, and being supportive of a deeply reactionary approach to popular change in society. So, but that's the kind of the context. That's how this happens. And maybe I can pass on to one of the others to maybe talk about what that means in practice.
Yep, Suhaiymah, do you want to build on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think something that comes to mind when just to kind of approaching this question of how pervasive is surveillance, I think even in writing the book that I wrote, when the majority of us think about surveillance, like it's very easy to think about quite overt methods. I think we're thinking about like entrapment, perhaps CCTV cameras, perhaps we have an awareness of like a public policy like Prevent, and the fact that there is a legal duty upon public sector workers to look out for signs of radicalisation amongst people, and we know how that detrimentally affects Muslim communities in particular, but targets all sorts of kind of political opinions or just anything that generally is disruptive of I suppose what the state would like to hear and see. But something that I just want to add in this conversation is that I think we have to be really, we have to really query like surveillance from its very, the very logic that it uses to justify itself. So what we hear about surveillance is that obviously it's required to keep us safe from real crime. And then we kind of end up contesting, well, what's real and what's not, who does and doesn't deserve it. But I think really where the debate ought to be is, doing away with the logic of surveillance itself, that far from it actually being about securing our safety, that actually what a lot of surveillance is purely data gathering, information gathering, and that a big part of the role that plays is social control. And so one of the things I just wanted to mention as an example in the research and the work I've done, and even in my own experience, is counter-extremism surveillance, I think it comes in really interesting guises that you really wouldn't expect. And so as an artist, I've had the experience of literature festivals that I've been taking part in being funded by counter-extremism streams. So, there's one called Building a Stronger Britain Together. And so as a result of this, you have kind of a really covert form of surveillance wherein it's just a form of, an organization being funded, reporting back to the funder. The funder happens to be in the Home Office, but through those methods, you then have set up a system wherein actually civic life, arts are being surveilled. And, because it's tied to the British values agenda, which was just mentioned, what happens if you're running a poetry workshop and, a Muslim woman comes to the workshop and she happens to be a bit quiet? Do you report that as a sign of, her kind of isolation, her unwillingness to engage? Is that a lack of toleration? And I think the reason I mentioned that example is that I think surveillance isn't necessarily in the guises that we always expect. And yet that is still inherently, that's a Home Office stream. That's a counter-extremism stream. This falls under the work that, technically we're told counterterrorism police and, the military do, but actually this is being outsourced to every single member of society. And I think for me, the thing that I think about when it comes to that also is that because this is about social control, we internalize it ourselves. And I think that's a really interesting part of surveillance in the way that it is so pervasive right now, is that, you limit your own speech, really. That's the power of it, that it doesn't require there to be a CCTV camera on the entrance of every door. That doesn't require every single person to be stopped and searched or to be detained. In fact, the power of it is that you only have to do a little bit of that for entire communities to understand that they have already been criminalized, and therefore that surveillance is kind of is exactly it's already happening and does happen. And so you start preemptively policing your own speech. You preemptively police the places that you go, the people that and I think that the title of my book is Tangled in Terror. And just as my final point on this, I was thinking a lot about the tangle, right? So say you're surveilled in school, you're reported to prevent. This affects, you become extremely anxious. Where do you go now? The next service that you try to use is also embroiled in surveilling you. If you try to use the NHS, you say you need respite from that. You go to, you want to go to a youth club, maybe you want to play some football to let out some steam. Actually, that's also bound up in counter-extremism agenda and is funded by the Home Office too. And so then you're reported. So this is the tangle that I kind of wanted to touch on. And I think it is a tangle of surveillance, but it's not necessarily in the ways that we overtly and historically have thought of it, although they are still deeply embedded in those counterinsurgency methods that have always existed through colonial policing in particular.
Suhaiymah, that was actually a very thorough answer, and it draws on so many of the ideas that I had flowing through my own head as well. I mean, the question was how widespread is it and who does it impact? And I think the kind of popular cultural representation of surveillance kind of equates surveillance agencies, MI5, MI6 policing, political policing, on the same kind of level as God almost, that they are everywhere and anywhere, monitoring, watching, listening, able to pierce themselves into your most private and intimate of spaces. And I'm sure there is evidence to prove that they can do that. But contrary to the popular cultural representations of surveillance and spying, the agencies do not have an infinite number of resources, financial and human, and they cannot monitor and watch and listen to every single thing all the time. So what they instead do is that they rely upon ordinary members of the public to become the eyes and ears of the state through what I think an appropriate word to describe that would be everyday surveillance. So from early on after the 9/11 attacks, for example, you had the anti-terror hotline that was launched, in which if your neighbor was spending their time in their living room with their curtains drawn for too long, then you must report that to the anti-terror hotline. Then you had the extremist surveillance unit online, where you report radical videos or extremist content online. And then you had, of course, the Counterterrorism and Security Act 2015, which integrated the prevent duty to allow public sector workers to share information and intelligence with the relevant law enforcement authorities in order to catch those people who were considered to be future terrorists. So it's not MI5 or the agencies that are driving this kind of surveillance activity, but it's everyday ordinary members of the public who have been kind of co-opted in some instances, or in other instances coerced, because if you don't comply with the prevent duty, then you are technically in violation of the law, and that carries a penalty within its own self. So they're coercing public sector institutions to share this information and intelligence. And of course, who does that surveillance and that kind of surveillance landscape impact and affect the most? It's clear that if you have a history of constructing racialized and Muslim communities through a discourse of Orientalism and racism, then it's natural that you always become uber suspicious of people who are racialized, even though the prevent training, for example, may well say, no, don't pick on someone just because they're wearing a headscarf or they've got black skin or brown skin or they've got a varying kind of length of beard. The reality is most people forget that training very quickly, and they resort to what a police officer once said to me in an interview when I was doing my fieldwork was a gut feeling. And that gut feeling is always driven by prejudice. It's socially constructed notions of common sense around who the criminal is and who the suspect is or who looks a bit sinister and suspicious. And, I have personal experience of having lived this, not only through my own arrest and detention and the subsequent years of surveillance, but way before, many, many years ago when I started driving a car, I was routinely being stopped. Only from July of this year until last week, I've been stopped in my car 4 times because of apparently the nature, the model of the car that I drive. And it's a new car, it's a Volkswagen. So that whole social construction, representation of who constitutes a threat is basically informing the way that ordinary people are understanding and acting against and towards racialized communities. And the effects of that, without delving into too much detail or going on for too long, is, of course, psychological trauma, which Suhaiymah just described, and the kind of psychosis and the hypervigilance and the kind of internalization of those mechanisms of power, what Foucault calls governmentality, where we constantly, censor and shape our own behavior so we don't upset power in case power comes knocking on our door. And that's when when you're doing that we're living actually in a surveillance society. And the damages that causes and the exclusion, the sense of isolation and fear that spreads is actually one of the most anti-democratic kind of things that can exist in a democratic society, which carries profoundly negative effects.
Thank you, Rizwaan. And I think that illustrates the idea of a tangle so well. Again, that idea that even if you are not coming into direct contact with these types of surveillance or knowingly come into contact with them, you still feel as if you're existing in relation to them, or you're policing yourself or policing people around you in relation to them. And I think both of you talk in your books about this idea of kind of anticipating crime. And I know, Suhaiymah, you talk about preparatory activity and how that kind of disproportionately targets Muslims. And I wanted to ask a bit more about what are the dangers of this kind of preemptive approach? How is the anticipation of crime in itself harmful?
Yeah, I think just to expand on that point, that, so I mean, a lot of the ways that terrorism is defined in the law are, I think really beyond what most people would assume. I think our image of whatever terrorism constitutes is usually violence. But actually the majority of convictions in the country for terrorism-related convictions are not, and they're to do usually with holding literature, having literature on your laptop or your device, or something along those lines. And, lawyers who I quote in my book have said things like, the majority of people are terrorists by negligence. What's the impact of this then? So one of the things I was thinking about a lot when writing the book, and, from interviewing people that I spoke to, is that there's an awareness, I think, in wider society that, actually just reading something, I mean, actually, Rizwaan's case is a fantastic example that only had to happen to Rizwaan for every Muslim student or, you know, academic or person even who enjoys reading to know that, oh, I can be profiled because I'm Muslim for reading this type of literature that could be deemed controversial. And that there's a threat of violence or coercion behind that therefore makes me wary. And so one of the, there's actually two examples I'll give that. So one of the things that I was really struck by was that I interviewed a lawyer who works with people who experience the SIAC courts. So that's where you can have secret evidence used against you, right? Now, what's really interesting about this is that because you don't get to see the evidence used against you because it's usually on national security grounds, lawyers end up going with their clients through basically their entire life story, trying to ascertain, you know, is there anything that could be deemed suspicious, dodgy, controversial, suspect in what you've done? And I thought, you know, obviously that sounds horrendous, but I actually made me think about the fact that I think this is almost an everyday practice that as Muslims and racialized people, I think we do to ourselves already, because that's what preemptive policing yourself is. It's to say, is there anything that I am doing that could be deemed a preparatory act for terrorism? And we know that that, you know, includes just all of this broad stuff like writing poetry. And then I was thinking about the impact of hearing that on myself and, you know, doing this research on myself. And one of the things was, you know, Schedule 7, where people are stopped at the border, and that, you know, there doesn't have to be, it's sort of really, really broad in discretion, this law, right? So, you know, we know that Muslims are just stopped disproportionately, but we also know that the effectiveness of this law is completely like ridiculous. I think the percentage is like 0.007% of people are actually kind of taken, you know, I don't know, charged or moved on to the next level. And I remember when I heard that statistic, I didn't use this in the book, but I remember wanting to use the fact that you're actually more likely to share a birthday with both officers than you are to be like charged with anything after being stopped under Schedule 7, which I just think is really wild. But actually what's the kind of point of making that point is that it's not about efficiency or effectiveness, it's about data gathering. And this is something that Rizwaan talks about in his book loads. But I think the point I want to make here is that as a result, if you're aware that data is being gathered on you, like what do you, when you go to the airport, it doesn't matter who you are, what you've done, whether you're political or not political. I think we're all aware that you want to, I'll speak for myself. I'm going to delete my text histories. I'm going to remove social media from my apps. And that's the thing that I think is another bit. It's that the awareness, just simply the awareness that legislation exists, the awareness that people have been and can be detained, the awareness that people have been and can be charged and convicted, all of that simply has to exist to have that coercive and policing effect on people, because the breadth of the law and the breadth of that discretion that Rizwaan just described, and the fact that we know that we are bodies associated with crime, means that you are pre-criminalizing yourself, and you're preempting a future violence which you may know that you will never perpetrate, but that because you are deemed to be, you know, fitting the profile of someone who, in the logic of, you know, counterterrorism, will, then you treat yourself, you basically apply the logic of preemptive criminalization to yourself. And I think that's the thing that I found most sort of distressing about, you know, doing this research and writing this book. But I think that it's really, and I think it's really important when we talk about trauma, you know, also we think about communal trauma. And, you know, that's the point I want to emphasize, you know, that, you know, it can, an individual like Rizwaan can experience that trauma, but then the communal trauma as well that is carried by the rest of us who know that happened and know why that happened and know it's unjustified. And I think that's really, it's so powerful, and it's such a coercive, it's such a coercive weapon that really, I don't think it's spoken about enough, to be honest.
Am I allowed to come in here, Misha? So I mean, if you're anticipating a future crime happening and you're acting on that assumption that certain, within their own right, indicators which are all legal and legitimate, or let's just call it legitimate as opposed to legal, because law is political. If they're all legitimate, then not only are you constantly engaged in profiling people, in marking them out on databases, criminalizing them for engaging in completely legitimate and normal behavior for a particular age group, for example, someone who's experimenting with politics or political activism, or the way they express their identity through their clothing choices and so on and so forth. Not only are you criminalizing those ordinary things, but if you do act on a particular anticipation that is based not on actual evidence of criminal wrongdoing, but on the belief that somebody is, for example, in possession of information because they are trying to use it for a terrorist purpose, irrespective of their actual reason for possessing it, because that's what the law criminalizes. It's not your intent that's relevant, but it's actually the nature of the item or the information that you possess that's criminal, right? So if you act on that basis and you arrest, for example, somebody, the outcome of that is that you, even if they're released without charge, like myself and 2,418 people from 9/11 until March 2021 have been released without charge, you list them on the police national computer for 99 years, irrespective of the outcome of that particular encounter. So every time that individual then is stopped by the police again, because they have a flag next to their name, then the police ask them questions about that and they collect more intelligence. And this is something that I talk about in my book in much more detail around how this intelligence cycle just constantly reinforces itself and builds on itself based on a very dodgy piece of intelligence to start with in the first place. So it becomes this vicious cycle, like a hamster on a wheel, constantly going round and round and round. But the actual start of that profile or that surveillance profile was kind of problematic in the first place. Now, when somebody is stopped, for example, and searched or arrested, like Suhaiymah was saying, how it has that broader disciplinary effect within a particular target community. So if a young black male, for example, is being stopped because they are suspected to be part of a gang or carrying a weapon, other black males become afraid when they hear about their friend being stopped. So they internalize to some extent that sense of fear. And the same with terrorism and Muslim communities. But the state actually knows that all of its acts of violence will have this impact when that particular act of violence is communicated. They know this throughout history, that propaganda of the deed is taking an action in order to communicate a message. And in the actual book, I've written an entire section on how that particular practice draws its inspiration from counterinsurgency or militarized theory, doctrine, and practice as a way of dissuading others within completely legitimate behavior and activities to stop doing what they're doing, to stop resisting, to stop questioning, to stop engaging with the process. And that, of course, carries an inherent anti-democratic flavor, but also stops people from holding the government and the state to account because it's based upon a coercive threat that something bad will happen to you if you go about doing whatever it is that you're doing. So the logic of anticipating future threats that have not materialized, I'm not just talking about prevent here, but I'm also talking about the entire legal architecture, the counterterrorism laws, which if you look at the data set, and I have because I'm a party animal, but actually it shows that from 9/11 until March 2021, which is when I've last checked the data, it actually shows that the top two offenses used to arrest, charge, and convict people for terrorism are Section 58, which is what's known as a strict liability offense. That's at number 2. It doesn't require the state to prove intent, just the mere possession that's a crime. And the top one is actually acts preparatory to terrorism, which kind of, pun intended, blew up when the Syrian civil war started because the police and special branch were intercepting people at the border on suspicion that they were actually traveling overseas in order to engage in armed combat in the Syrian civil war. So the kind of extent and the speed with which that law was used actually sent the figures all over the place because from 9/11 until 2021, it was information and then Syria happened. Point is, both of those offenses and all of those convictions that have taken place for both of those offenses are preemptive. It's where an individual does not have to actually commit an act of violence. And that's what's driving this whole thing, that anticipation that someone will go on to commit crime in the future, which carries all the risks that I've just highlighted.
Can I just come in with one small point? I mean, Rizwan's talked about the whole anti-democratic nature of this. A lot of the work that we do is with people attempting to exercise their rights to freedom of assembly, to be campaigners, to go out on the streets, right? And we've just had a new piece of legislation that's designed to make that more difficult. And one of the things that we've argued is that in order to identify the people that are the noisy protesters or likely to cause disruptive protests, there will be a massive increase in surveillance. And part of the reason for trying to encourage people to think about that is because, for all the reasons that have been talked about already, the so-called chilling effect on the right to protest doesn't affect people equally. I mean, if you're already part of a racialized community that feels as though you're constantly under surveillance, you don't experience the sense of dread about the potential impact of police surveillance for somebody who isn't in that position. And you kind of want people, and what we want people is for everybody to take it seriously, because it keeps everybody safe. You know, if you're going to be part of an organizing group where there's people who don't really care too much about the way the information is shared, and so much of the protest-based surveillance is all about open source materials, it's people sharing stuff online and so on, right? You need to be thinking about those people who are the most vulnerable to police surveillance. Otherwise, you don't have the kind of united movements that you want, right? The ones that are actually going to bring about the change. And it has been deeply frustrating over the time I've been doing this, to try and have to constantly re-explain that to new generations, particularly of, white activists, that you need to be thinking about the different consequences of, if you're a Kurd member of the Kurdish community, you're talking about the Kurdish struggle, then you're going to be treated differently by the police than if you're a white activist. If you're talking about Palestine in particular, if you're a Palestinian living in Britain, your ability to be able to talk openly about that subject is completely different. And what we need to be able to do is to find ways to encourage solidarity. And that means you take the issue of surveillance seriously. Everybody does. Because if you don't, then that means that not everybody can be part of the movements that you're organizing.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to remind the audience that we're going to be taking questions in a minute, so please do be thinking about your questions. The last thing I wanted to ask before we opened up to audience questions is, I know, Rizwaan, you talk about this extensively in your book about the impact on your mental health of this type of surveillance. And I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more about what is the psychological impact of this type of state violence that we're talking about.
Sure. So it's so perverse. It dominates every aspect of your existence. Nothing can exist outside of it, because what it does is it takes away your sense of choice. And if you have no choice left, then very dark thoughts start crossing your mind as to how to establish some sense of choice from what you're going through, or establish some sense of choice. So, for example, the thought of suicide occurs to you because an act of suicide then becomes an act of rebellion, an act of total autonomy, that, you know what, you can't take this right away from me if I kill myself, right? It's a very dark thought, a thought that unfortunately I've had before, but I've never acted on, thankfully, because of my faith in God. Also, at the same time, there was another thought that occurred to me. Shall I just go and hand myself in and say, look, whatever it is that I've done, I'm innocent, but you guys, and they are mostly guys that make up these agencies, you guys do what it is that you need to do in order to just take this vice in which you've put my mind off me. Constantly, I was on overdrive in trying to just hide from this this kind of metaphorical camera that existed and that was listening to me through my smartphone, watching my every move, logging who I was talking to, listening to what I was saying, sending different people into my life in order to kind of extract something or get me to say something that they could then weaponize and use against me. It's constant hypervigilance. It's that fear that the only way that you can exist is through complete and utter silence, because anything you say will be taken and used against you. And it led to that sense of self-disciplining to such an extent where I just didn't say anything, where you just become silent. And when I did reach out and try, let me rephrase that. When I did try to reach out and get help, I couldn't go to the NHS because I was scared that the NHS had been pierced by the surveillance state and that everything I said would be passed on to the agencies who would then act on it. When I was forced to go by my family against my will in 2013, I remember being very, very ambiguous with them. You know, I didn't tell them what I was going through. I didn't tell them what I was thinking, because in my head, they're all spies and working for the surveillance apparatus, and saying anything right now is dangerous. So there was that. Even in 2018, once I'd been kind of told to spot the triggers of what a mental health breakdown or psychosis, as they called it, were, I still couldn't draw upon the help of the NHS because my mind loses the ability to use your rational faculties to determine the difference between reality and construction or social construction or fear. And it's not just out of thin air that fear emerges. I've got it in black and white that this is what the state is doing to me or has done to me. This is how the state works. How then do you deny this experience? And I remember going to mental health workers and they would just deny it because they didn't have the resource, they didn't have the staff who understood how the logics of racialized surveillance and state violence work, and therefore pills or mental health medicine becomes the only option, the kind of panacea to all of these different issues, which are then prescribed to you, and that's it. There's no therapy. So the way I describe it in the book is a lot more coherent than the way I'm doing here. But the way I would describe it is your entire existence becomes dominated to such an extent that you cannot function. You cannot maintain relationships, friendships. You question your family ties. You question your family members, like my father, for example, that these guys are all working for the surveillance state. It completely debilitates you from carrying out any normal function of your life. Now, what I'm describing is a very kind of hard-edged impact, but even normal people are constantly self-disciplining themselves because of the fear that they are under surveillance. Don't say this, or making a joke out of something constantly, which shows that trauma, of course, might express itself from in a very kind of a vivid way from someone who's lived this. But actually, even if you haven't been arrested, even if you haven't been detained and you're just going about your ordinary life and you belong to the suspect community, that actually the effects of this are quite profound. So what I'm describing here, the fear, the lack of choice, the constant monitoring and watching and listening, all of this stuff is actually felt quite routinely throughout the community, irrespective of whether you've been a victim or a subject of state violence or not.
Yeah, and I think this is something you articulate really well in the book, is like this idea of that mental health can't be viewed in a vacuum, you know, because I think with these sorts of experiences, it's very easy to say, you know, it's illogical or unrealistic beliefs about the world, but actually like they are rooted in a social context related to things that actually did happen to you. And, you know, you can say delusions of persecution, but you were a person that actually was persecuted. And I think it's really important that you articulate it in that way. We're gonna go on to questions from the audience now. Okay, so one question we've got is, do you think the nationality bill will make things worse going forward? Does anyone want to take that one first?
I mean, I can just say really quickly, like, and I think to answer this question and build on something that both Rizwaan and Kevin said, which is that, yes, I do think so, but also I think in two ways, like perceived and in a sort of material sense. And what I mean by that is that one of the things that's I think one of the things that's really interesting in what both people have just said there is that I think I would use the word the depoliticizing effect of these surveillance like logics and laws. And so in terms of the Nationality and Borders Bill, I think that the articulation of the idea that without notification you can be stripped of your citizenship on national security grounds, I think was already having a chilling effect in the sense that, okay, the lack of notification, but also the lack of the not knowing the grounds. I think there's like what I'm trying to say is that I think there's yes, it will have a real effect, but also the real effect causes a perceived like impact. And so one of the things that I think about a lot is just how then, as a result of internalizing that, how sometimes I hear the critique that, young Muslims are not like politically active enough, or like, why are people not talking about XYZ issue? And I think that, a lot of the analyses that are given don't address the fact that the perception of threat and the reality of threat, as you both mentioned, it's very gaslighting to kind of talk about only the perception. But what I mean is that it doesn't have to affect every single person. Not everybody has to be stripped of their citizenship, but the fact that we know that you can be, and potentially now without notification, is so powerful that I think it's completely debilitating to a lot of political activism, especially amongst Muslims. And I think the point Kevin made was really important, that I think the seriousness of that is not really understood across the board. And I think for many people, like, yeah, the Nationality and Borders Bill is bad. Obviously, it's really bad. It's threatening to democratic norms, blah, blah, blah. But actually, that real kind of threat, that fear of like, oh, that's me, that's my family, that's my grandparents, that's my parents. I think I think the kind of, there's a lack of understanding there. And I think the kind of targeted nature of that on racialized communities is I think will be and is already very debilitating. But yeah, there's way more that can be said about that particular bill.
I mean, if I can come in very briefly, I mean, there's always a danger that you get kind of trapped into a circle of despair with this. But I mean, it re-emphasizes the point for me that if there's not actively organised solidarity for those people who are most affected by the consequences of oppressive legislation, then that's the only alternative that's left. So, we've talked about, in our campaign work, we talked about the importance of those people who are in a position to be able to take a stand against Prevent, for instance, stepping up because they can, not because of some argument that, oh, one day they might come for us. I mean, I accept that those arguments have some merit, but no, because it's the right thing to do. Because if you don't stand with people that are suffering from the oppression of the state, then you're essentially standing on the side of the state. In relation to the really scary things that are in that bill, in that what the now acts, if we allow a situation to arise where people don't stand in solidarity with those people who are being pushed out of political activism because of the fearful consequences of what the state might do, then what kind of organisers are we? What kind of political organisers are we really? What type of movements are we, and what sort of change are we trying to bring about if we're excluding people from the really scary things that are in the? It's kind of why so much of the emphasis of the work that we do on is to say you need to focus on that issue around solidarity, because if you don't, we're shutting people out with those from the organising that needs to happen to bring about a better world. So political activism, because of it's not just obviously fearful consequences, nationalities and borders, it's so much else of the terrible legislation that's coming out from this government. But it can be resisted. But we just can't assume that resistance will happen somehow spontaneously. It needs to be organised. Now, the work that we do on is to say
Okay, should we go to another question? Suhaiymah, do you feel that because people self-censor, they ostracize themselves, and that therefore leads to a different type of social separation? And would this not make radicalisation, in fact, easier?
I think that's such an interesting question, right? Because I think this really speaks to like the very logic of the state, which is incredible. Because if you say that simultaneously, isolation and ostracizing of oneself is a sign of radicalization, then you both criminalize the person who is active, engaged, speaking up in class, like protesting, and the person who, out of fear of the repercussions of that doesn't. I completely refute the idea that like people who are isolated are, likely to become. The concept of radicalization, I think, really needs to be critiqued. The very idea of what that means and what that is. But I would absolutely agree that by the state's very own logic of what radicalization is, it in of itself pushes people into, I think Aaron Kanani writes really well about this, that if you really want to kind of tackle political violence in any form, then you need to allow for open and engaged discussion. You need to have spaces where people can, whether they're students or whether they're anyone else, to be able to say, here's an idea, what does everyone else think? And for people to be able to like critique that, who are your peers, who you respect, who are your mentors or your teachers, rather than to say, we're not allowed to talk about this, do not mention this. And, one of the people I interviewed in this book was an imam in Southeast London. And I just found it really fascinating that he said that, by the logics of the state, really, that he is kind of encouraged to say to people that, when people say to him, you don't talk enough about Palestine, you don't talk enough about the Uyghurs, you don't talk about this, you don't talk about that. By the logic of the state, he should be saying, we mustn't talk about this. But actually that he, I think in a far more wise approach than the state, recognizes that doing that would actually have the opposite effect. And so he's really open to kind of having those conversations, but seeing that as the only way forward. So I think in a nutshell, that's a really good, the question itself exemplifies the logic of the state.
Yeah. And then I think this is for Rizwaan. What advice would you give to someone who was arrested like you were? What would you have done differently, I guess, if anything?
Hindsight's always 2020, isn't it? So you can always look back and think, I should have done this differently. But as a 21-year-old, a very naive young man, I used to operate on the assumption that the police were generally the good guys. And there were, good guys and bad guys in the world. And if I told them the truth, and I was candid and upfront with them about everything, that somehow that would absolve me of any allegations or suspicion that I was facing. That was short-sighted and wrong. So if I was to give anybody advice, I'd say the moment that you go into the custody of the police, whether that's at the roadside, whether that's in a police station, whether it's for armed robbery, whether it's for a crime you haven't committed, whether it's for terrorism, do not say a word. Make sure that you understand the basics of your rights and what you are required to do and what you are entitled to receive, and immediately call on the support of a suitable lawyer, because it's ultimately the loopholes in the law that allow the police to do the things that they oftentimes do. So I would say you need someone who's versed in legalese to actually come to your support. In fact, I still remember till this day, when I met one of the lawyers who was leading the team of lawyers who were representing me in the station, Tayyib Ali, he said even if he was arrested, quote, even if he was arrested, he would still ask for a lawyer because two lawyers are better than one. So I would say even if you are smart and you know the law, you still ask for legal advice and you operate according to the basis that the police are not your friends and that they are not there to support you in this difficult moment. I think that's kind of the first and foremost piece of advice that I would give. And other than that, I remain silent because of my legal advice, and it actually helped me massively because I gave them less words that they could use and twist and turn in order to build a case against me. And I put the onus on the police to prove whether the possession of this library book was essentially being used for sinister terrorist purposes or academic research. So I would say, know your rights and draw on the help of lawyers in order to ensure that you're getting the right type of support in that moment of total vulnerability that you're faced with.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, because again, you talk about this thing in the book of being like, well, I haven't done anything wrong, so why should I need a lawyer? But unfortunately, the police, that's not really the logic of the police. We've got another question, which is public sector workers and members of the public need to stop working as the state's prevent/hostile environment apparatus. How do we organize in our communities to make that happen?
Well, can I start with this? I think public sector workers, members of the community, absolutely. But the reality is that the state knows. Like, so, for example, I'm going to refer here to the Prevent program. When the Prevent program was initially rolled out across the UK, nobody was really engaging with it. Vice chancellors weren't interested. Students' unions weren't interested. Lecturers weren't doing it. And then they created the Counterterrorism and Security Act 2015 in the same way as immigration legislation or legislation to monitor migration, in order to basically compel and force, let me rephrase that, to coerce members of the public sector to become the eyes and ears or the surveillance, part of the surveillance state. So when you're talking about how do we resist it, I think the first thing we have to do, the answer is actually in the question, we organize. We have to work in solidarity, in union, in order to basically explain how this surveillance actually compels, coerces, and co-opts us into becoming part of the surveillance state in order to show how it works. And then at the same time, we need to find allies who are not only going to be targeted, like Kevin said earlier, from these policies, but who actually have the social and cultural capital to be able to still talk about these issues. Because I can tell you, as a racialized Muslim, my freedom under the Nationality and Borders Act is now, and my citizenship is actually becoming increasingly precarious. And I'm scared that if I say something in the same style and way that I am doing right now, I might actually be sent back to Pakistan, even though I am not a Pakistani citizen. My parents and grandparents come from there, right? And this is a thought that comes through my mind. It is there now on top of all the other coercive threats that we're dealing with. So I think the answer is we organize and we effectively stand in solidarity with one another and organizations who are kind of the leaders in this field, as well as individuals. And we make visible how the state is compelling us through coercive threats and the law to do this activity. And that's the only way, through a campaign of education, empowerment, and solidarity, can communities ever resist this kind of stuff.
Anyone else want to add in, or shall we go to the next one?
I'll add very briefly. One of the problems is, I mean, Rizwan's absolutely right, that unable to force people to participate in the surveillance state, the government then introduced the 2015 Act, which compelled people, the duty upon people. But of course, this is the approach that they're adopting elsewhere. So the new Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act applies a prevent style duty to the issue around violent crime and report and encouraging people to report on young people who may be at risk of knife crime and so on. It's the same thing. And it puts public sector workers, particularly council workers, youth workers, etc., people are likely to be interacting with those people who are most likely to be accused of those violent crimes, in an incredibly difficult position. And part of the question around solidarity is not just solidarity with those people who are going to be affected by this, but also with the people that are quite often very, very reluctant to have anything to do with this, but are placed in a position of either you do this or you get another job. And that's going to have to be something that is thought about a lot more, about how you find a way to undermine the obligations that are placed on people through acts of solidarity. I mean, there's not a simple answer to that, other than the suggestions that Rizwan's made about the importance of education and people knowing about their rights. But it is a really difficult one to know how to tackle, because it's expanding. the idea that you pass legislation to compel people in public service to be the eyes and ears of the state is the way the government has been going for the last sort of decade, in which I imagine it will, given the opportunity, it will find another issue where it wants to force council workers and teachers and NHS staff to be reporting on people for whatever reason that the government's decided they need to be, kept an eye on. That's the basis of what a surveillance state is.
I just had a really quick thing that I suppose is related to the question of like resistance in general, but I think something that I think about a lot with this as well is also making the case that, I think on the one hand, that there's also the case to be made that there's by the logics of what the welfare state should do, Prevent directly undermines that. You cannot give everybody the same quality of healthcare, for example, if you're surveilling, criminalizing, and Medac did a fantastic kind of report on this, where there's just so many countless examples of how doctors and nurses, etc., are actively having to undermine the quality of care that they give to people of color and Muslims because they are having to treat them as criminal. And so I think there's just that argument I just wanted to add. But also, I think in general, I think there's a case that we can make that we are more able to, because I think one of the arguments that is often made, right, in terms of from the state's point of view is, okay, so what's the alternative, right? Like, what is it that you propose? And I think we have to be really clear with our messaging that there is no alternative. We don't want to replace Prevent with anything at all, but instead that we know how to make each other safe. And I think that's something that I've found really kind of powerful about a lot of the conversations around abolition in the last few years. But I think in particular, when we think about something like Prevent, it's really important to say that actually the role that this plays in society is not one that we believe is worth replicating or reproducing in any form. And in fact, what makes people safe is the very opposite of what this does. And so, yeah, I just think it's important for us to also have those very clear demands in terms of like what we imagine for ourselves, because I think one of the things that Prevent and surveillance in general also does is that it limits our imaginations. It makes it impossible for us to believe there is anything beyond securitization and surveillance. And those two things mask themselves as having something to do with safety, when in reality, our safety is, fully funded welfare, well-being services, nourishment, healing. And so I think it's, we have a right and we have the capacity, and we need to articulate those demands and very clearly that actually what we want is safety on our own terms. And what that looks like is what people are already having to do in secret and covert and hidden ways, but actually what it could look like, it is so much more than that. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point, like that thing of being like, oh, how can we tweak Prevent and like make it better than it is, like if it's not achieving what it's, supposed to do, but actually how reform can often just lead to bolstering the very things that we don't want to bolster. We've got one more question, which is kind of linked to stuff we've touched on about like expansion of policing and surveillance. Do you think the Police, Crimes, Courts and Sentencing Bill is the culmination of the government working against freedoms for the public, or is it just the start?
Maybe I can take this one because we've been campaigning on the issue for the last year. I think it's important to understand that people understand that the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act, as it now is, isn't a creature solely of the government. There's been active lobbying for the expansion of powers that have come from the police, and the police and institutions of the state are active political players in trying to expand their role. And it comes from an understanding that their understanding that you just need more powers, you need more of everything, you need to get more police officers, you need more laws. Because that's the way that they will be able to handle the situations that they say they're finding increasingly difficult to deal with. And what none of that's doing is addressing the reasons why people are expressing political views, why they're going out on the streets, the genuine anger and alarm about the state of the world, right? That's what governments are not doing at all. And as long as, and I think if you have any criticism, any critique of capitalism, you expect that is the way that governments are going to continue. Unfortunately, it does mean that for all the kind of the frustration and anger about how the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act is an extreme response to the situation around, not just around protests, but also about encampments for travellers and the issues around violent crime and all the other bits of the acts. The next one will be even worse. And this does come to the point that was made, that we are, as campaigners, need to be arguing for less laws.
Kevin, you've just gone on mute.
And that was my fault. I just banged the table. I do apologise. This is what happens when I get into this particular subject. It is absolutely the case that if we are, and this has already been said, because the next set of law will probably be the things that the government wasn't able to get through Parliament in the last round, there will be another piece of public order legislation or criminal justice legislation, and it will be worse. And we have to start getting ready to resist that when that comes along, because that's been the journey, the direction of travel for the last 20, 30 years. There's been so many pieces of criminal justice legislation, and they've been adding and adding and adding to the powers that the police have. And we need to be arguing, as I think was probably missing from the bit when I went quiet, which is, what abolition means, if it means anything at all, is fewer police, is fewer powers, is alternatives to that kind of coercive, oppressive approach that is being articulated by the state. And we have to find and offer those as alternatives ourselves, because they're not going to come from debates in Parliament, they're going to come from us.
Thank you, Kevin. I am conscious that we're coming towards the end, so I just wanted to ask one more question before we wrap up, which is on this note of resistance and kind of what we can do. How do you think that we can resist state surveillance, particularly when acts of resistance might themselves be branded as, get people branded as extremists? What can we do? What's the strategy?
I'll take this one first, Misha. I think the first thing is education, informing ourselves by engaging with either knowledge or talks like this or events as to how surveillance operates and what it seeks to do, and making visible the effects of that particular form of activity and the way it harms us, in order to show others who might not be subject to that kind of violence that this is the effect of the violence, even though it does not lead to a bloody nose or a broken rib cage, that this is still harming us and it's still affecting us in ways that are invisible, in ways that are insidious, in ways that are damaging us as human beings. So I would say education and understanding, making visible the effects of that, and organizing collectively in order to challenge these particular policies and laws. And just to draw on what Kevin concluded his point with, he's absolutely right. I think the change will come from the bottom. It will come from the community, who will be the drivers of this resistance, to basically produce a self-contained pool of resources and healing and ideas and nourishment, like Suhaiymah said. That is actually going to be the answer to a lot of this thing. It's going to be the community compelling everyone to follow suit rather than it being top down. So I would say that is my strategy of resisting. Other than that, I would say, look, you cannot stop people spying on you. We cannot stop people attending this particular session and listening to us talk. Nobody could stop Mark Kennedy when he was spying on those climate activists. Nobody could stop the police officers who were monitoring the Faruqi family. Nobody can stop these individuals because of the very sophisticated and advanced nature, the technologies of surveillance that exist today. So I would say, rather than focusing on that, of course, we need to question, understand, critique, and campaign against that. But rather than focusing on that, I would say, let's focus on organizing and building a movement that challenges these things.
I don't disagree with that at all. I just want to add two things. One is something that I've personally found really useful, and that I think in terms of that thing of increasing education understanding, is also recognizing that there are beneficiaries, that it's not random. And I think that can't be overstated. And what I mean by that is that when you understand that there are corporations and there are governments and there are stakeholders that benefit materially, so make profit on the back of selling surveillance technologies and kind of, research that is funded, think tanks that are funded, the logics and the idea of surveillance kind of being reinforced, that all lines people's pockets. I think that's a really important part of the understanding, because once you have that, it's not just like it's not like, oh, we're randomly being attacked and surveilled. It's like actually there are targets for also, like, in terms of where to kind of focus our attention. And I think even with Prevent, freedom of information requests have found that the report underpinning it, the reason that the government say that they can't share that information is in case a competing product is made for the market. And so I think it's really important to remember that there is that financial aspect to also surveillance. And just the only other thing I was going to add was that, I suppose, making sure in our resistance and in our thoughts that this is also anti-imperialist, right? Because I think the nature of a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today, it comes from historically colonial kind of practices of policing, but also today is still embedded in relations of imperialism. And I think the nation can never be our border can never be our horizon when it comes to thinking about how we resist it. There's simply no way to, remove surveillance only within the nation state. It has to be like a global endeavor. And the fact that global networks of surveillance exist mean that our resistance to those networks and those tools has to also be global. So they're just two things I wanted to
add. Just very quickly, I mean, many of the solutions have already been offered in parts of this discussion already. I mean, we launched a campaign today around, as a response to the new legislation that's come in, which doesn't say the legislation's bad. It talks about the importance of defending the idea of dissent. And of the sort of the four main things that are the straightforward pieces of practical response to that, they've all been touched on. So the importance of knowing your rights and making sure that you get access to decent lawyers is number one. The importance of understanding at least some of the basic issues around security as organisers, and understanding what the impacts of potential obstacles to organising come from surveillance. Being able to document and then publicise the abuses or misuses of police powers. And then the final thing, which is that idea about how we incorporate into all this the importance of keeping each other safe and offering solidarity when people need it, and avoid going down that route of, these protesters or this campaign is illegal and these are legal, this is acceptable, this is legitimate. But as campaigners, as people who are trying to bring about change, getting off the fence and actually offering solidarity to people who need it. So all those four things are the key elements of that campaign that we just launched today. And it doesn't offer an easy, simple solution, unfortunately. It is going to be a kind of a long, slow slog. But I think all of those things have got a much better chance of actually being able to push back against the expansion of state power than, essentially hoping for some politicians to maybe change the law, because I just don't think that's enough.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think that's a really good note to end on. I think it's really important that we have things to kind of take away and think about what we can practically do. So if you'd like to buy either of Suhaiymah or Rizwaan's books, there should be information on the page about where you can buy them. I would really recommend, because they're both amazing books. I want to say a big thank you to each of our speakers. You've been really great this evening. And also thank you to Pluto Press for hosting us. Finally, a huge thank you to our audience tonight, also for sending in your questions. And I hope you took as much away from this discussion as I did. Have a good evening.